Have you ever been at a restaurant faced with a dozen or more options and had no idea what to eat? Have you sometimes wanted to go back to the kitchen and look at things as they're being cooked so you can have a better sense of what you actually might like? Have you ever just wanted someone else to order for you? Have you ever been angry that somebody actually did? Do you sometimes feel like I ask too many questions? Welcome to Digesting Food Studies, the podcast that puts everything out on display so that you can pick and choose your favorites, nibbling and noshing on what most satisfies your hunger. I'm your calligrapher and front of house manager, David Santo. This episode considers the menu as documentation of cultural history and as representation of restaurant offerings. From our guests' points of view, menus tell of an official story of options and choice making, but also keep certain things off the record. As physical objects, they also carry physical traces of what they more discursively represent. Soup stains, smears of butter or gravy, side notes, the occasional drawing. In this way, they go beyond a list of foods to order. They also disorder our understandings of the past and present. The focus article today is Koby Song-Nichols' Can Historians Order Off the Menu? A Method for Historical Menu Analysis, which is from Volume 11, Number 2 of Canadian Food Studies, published in August of 2024. Alexia Moyer's Amuse-Bouche segment starts things off with a thoughtful exploration of the Northern Cookbook, an unusual artifact from 1967 that offers advice to home cooks in Canada's North on familial menu planning. It's a window into at least one history of the industrialization and colonialization of cuisine, but also a surprising portrait of intercultural negotiation. During our Chewing On Research conversation, Koby Song-Nichols shares his perspectives on a comprehensive method for menu analysis, and it goes beyond the surface of just the printed page. He also talks about the relational conversation he engages in with his resource materials as a historian of food who is often alone, well, at least alone as a human, in the archives. And then, in the aftertaste, former cook and current doctoral student Anson Hunt thinks out loud about the many roles that menus play in the highly dynamic systems of restaurants, eaters, cuisine, social class, and identity. All right, Alexia, what is on the menu today for our amuse-bouche?
I did bring you a menu,
Hey.
but I brought you a menu of a different kind. So rather than the bill of fare, the kind of menu that you get in a restaurant setting where someone else is doing the cooking for you, this is the kind of menu that you make in your own kitchen, the meal planning kind.
Oh, yes, okay.
This is a menu with a more limited audience, and in this way it can be more personal. Your choices are influenced by outside sources and by family preferences. The recipes may be trendy or classic. They may be rigidly planned out or quite loose. Your menu is determined by the fact that you can't always find everything or afford it, or it might not be the right season, or you may only have time to create certain dishes and not others. But the menu, which I lean on for this amuse-bouche, comes from Northern Cookbook, which is edited by Eleanor A. Ellis. Now, I first came across this cookbook through Julia Christensen's article, and it's called Eskimo Ice Cream and Craft Dinner Goulash, The Cultural Geographies of Food in 3 Cookbooks from the Northwest Territories.
Wow, even the title dates it very specifically.
Yes, yes. And this was published in Cuisine, the Journal of Canadian Food Cultures. And Northern Cookbook was one of these 3 books that make up her corpus. And I happen to have a copy of it. And this book renders the menu of the menu planning kind really public, and it also is very prescriptive in a number of ways. So this book was originally prepared as a centennial project by the Education Division, Northern Administration Branch, Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development.
Okay.
Which is now called Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. So my copy is the 1979 reprint, but the first edition came out in 1967. Oh. A key year for cookbooks in Canada for a number of reasons. So who is being educated here? Who is the intended audience? That's the question. It's actually split. So this book is dedicated to the people of the North. It is intended for the Northern housewife whether she be already present in the Northwest Territories or whether she, a Southerner, might benefit from learning more about the North. There are lots of quotes about what it's really like living in the North, the fact that it's not just a land of ice and snow, quote unquote, and that Northerners live in, quote, modern homes with wall-to-wall broadloom, end quote.
How modern.
There are about 8 proposed menus for each meal for breakfasts, lunches or light suppers, and dinners. And presumably the menu planner can offer her family a balanced meal that follows Canada's food guide.
That wonderful document.
Which is laid out for you in the introductory pages. So here's a sample breakfast for you, David, and something to put on your menu this week. Stewed prunes, Red River cereal with milk and sugar, enriched bannock, so called because it has milk powder and egg powder in it, jam or peanut butter, milk for the children, and tea or coffee. The sample lunch or light supper is creamed fish on toast or bannock, jellied fruit salad with Dreamway, and milk, tea, and coffee. And the dinner is roast ptarmigan and gravy, mashed potatoes, turnip balls and parsley butter, cabbage and pineapple salad, apple betty, and milk, tea, and coffee.
There's such weird mixes of here and there, north and south, and certainly not really mostly north. But, you know, the ptarmigan is, I guess, a nod to something a little less southern.
Yes, yes. So there are hints in the menu of the wider reach of the cookbook and also how it functions and doesn't function.
Yeah.
So the menu items and the recipes that follow don't always line up perfectly. I can find a recipe for stewed prunes and bannock mentioned in the sample breakfast, but not for the cabbage and pineapple salad for dinner. Presumably you already know how to make cabbage and pineapple salad.
I certainly do. That was the first thing I learned when I was in food school.
Exactly. I figured it was part of your weekly repertoire.
Oh, definitely.
The preface lays out the project in a very straightforward way. It is to record facts about some of the wild game birds, fish, fruit, and vegetables available in Canada's north, and to suggest methods by which these food may be prepared and served. So it's quite a factual book, but it's helpful to remind ourselves as to who is recording these facts and to what end. This is a government-led and funded publication.
Yeah, well, to what end is the giant question that rears its head in this whole discourse?
Yes, yes. There are a handful of recipes for ptarmigan listed on the menu, along with reindeer goulash, fried beaver tail, and not the kind that you find at the Byward Market in Ottawa, but the kind that is first skinned and brined and dredged in flour and then fried. There are additional instructions on how to prepare the pelt for market. There are recipes for baked char and stuffed whale roast and fireweed, which can be picked in springtime and used as a substitute for asparagus, and Labrador tea. There is even a chapter that summarizes the current game regulations in the Northwest Territories.
Wow.
So you know what you can shoot and when.
Well, you know, bizarrely, this is all sort of echoing of my 1930s edition of The Joy of Cooking, where you can learn to skin a squirrel and also make a chocolate cake cocaine.
Yeah. The menu is certainly of its time, with its collection of jellied fruit salads and aspics and boiled salad dressing. It was the pimento salad that gave me the most pause. Is it's lemon jelly with cream cheese balls and chopped pimentos in a mold and then garnished with a lettuce leaf.
I am trying not to, cough and laugh and sneeze into the microphone as you say that. I'm being very self-controlled right now.
I made it for lunch later, so you'll get to try it. Julia Christensen observes that the recipes are out of touch in other ways, and this at the time that it was written. So she writes, a recipe for chicken gumbo, for example, calls for sliced okra pods and fresh tomatoes, neither of which was easily found north of 60 in the late 1960s, and even now would likely be difficult to find in most settlements. Positanoese fish soup called for saffron and chopped parsley and sliced leek, even though most fruits and vegetables and herbs and seasoning available at that time were frozen, canned, or dried.
Well, the saffron lobbyists must have gotten that in there.
Could you imagine at the cost to make this soup? At least it's light to transport.
Yes, there's the upside.
Yeah. The cookbook's double focus is really often discernible. So editor Ellis advises young housewives to use foods that are available locally, that seal liver is just as tasty as calf's liver. But then there are substitutions for cooks who don't have access to country food. So veal can be used in place of lynx, and beef can be used in place of buffalo and caribou and deer and elk and moose and reindeer and venison.
Absolutely amazing. I mean, this is a great lead into our conversation with Koby Song-Nichols, because he also talks about how much menus like the backside of menus tell us? How many secrets are hidden within menus? How much is embedded in a menu that isn't necessarily just about the food, but all of the backstory and all the motivations of the writers, and then also of the users?
I was thinking of his work when I was going through the book, and I was looking for marginalia, because I know this is something that he looks at. But there isn't very much in the way of marginalia to give me a sense of who had this book before me and how it was used. There is just a little introduction in the first page, an inscription that says, "Happy birthday, Connie, love the Cohens, November 1988. So beyond the actual message, all I can tell you is that the writer likely went to school at the same time as my mother, because the handwriting is just the same.
Oh, you're being a very good historian then as you analyze this menu or this set of menus. Thank you so much. My appetite is definitely whetted for more.
Thank you, David.
Koby Song-Nichols is a historian and food studies scholar based in Toronto. His research follows the ways Chinese Canadians and Chinese Americans have used food to feed intercultural, intergenerational, and diasporic relations and communities. Check out the show notes also for a link to his article in CFS, which includes a very useful appendix featuring a menu of archival menu collections. So, Koby, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. I am really excited to talk to you about your article, "Can Historians Order Off the Menu?" I think it's a really distinctive piece for the journal, and I'm delighted to actually meet you.
Yeah, it's really nice to meet you and looking forward to our conversation.
Can you just tell us a little bit about why menus in particular, and using them as historical texts to read in an academic sense, why that's become an interest of yours?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of stumbled into it. So when I was starting my historical research, one of the first archival collections I came across was this massive menu collection that University of Toronto Scarborough just acquired. And since I was interested in the history of restaurants, or Chinese restaurants in particular, in Canada, US, it's like, oh, okay, these are the perfect documents to look at this, but they aren't necessarily the most easy documents to work with as a historian, because they don't have dates. I mean, that's the main one. So it's hard to date them specifically.
Right.
But they have so much good information. So I was really interested in trying to figure out how to get that information out and make it legible to historians.
Yeah. And I mean, as you say in the article right at the beginning, some of the information that's on menus is not what was originally printed on them, but sometimes it's the stuff that eaters add to them. And so some of the archival documents that you saw were marked up, had eaters' notes and comments and thoughts and ideas on them. And that also is part of the history of that menu and that the restaurant to which the menu is attached. So it makes the menu much larger than just a printed document.
Yeah. So that were the moments to really recognize that menus are a conversation between the restaurant, the restaurateur, and the diners. And so personally, in my history writing, those are the conversations I'm really interested in. And often those are the conversations that leave the least amount of archival records. Mm-hmm. And so to see them on the menu, it's like, oh, so yeah, especially when there's a lot of writing on a menu, it's like you can see those conversations really play out. But in the more subtle ways, like even when they aren't completely marked up, there's little hints about where these conversations went, whether it's a little tick mark on the side of the menu, or you can just see how menus changed over time. Like, oh, this dish was not as popular with customers. And so another dish pops up, or where the restaurant changed. These are all kind of represents conversations between the restaurants and the people who frequented them.
So like so many parts of our food world, our food systems, our food culture, menus are kind of, sometimes ephemeral, sometimes not so ephemeral, but they're often overlooked as resources, as real sites of information that can be read from a cultural sense and help to reveal what has either disappeared accidentally or intentionally over time, and how they are document or sometimes are not documents of what happened. So would you consider menus to be ephemera, or does it depend on the situation?
It definitely depends on the situation. I mean, what makes menus tricky to work with is that I think they fit into so many different categories of primary sources. Mm-hmm. And like in the same menu, there might be aspects that are more ephemeral and then aspects that are more like feels like a government document. Right. So, or like a catalog of trade ingredients. And so for me, it pulls like a lot of different historians' methods together, or it could if you took the time to look at these documents. For me, I'm seeing menus as timeless documents. It's like the restaurateur didn't necessarily want to link their menu to a specific time because they could use it the length of the as long as they could because they're expensive to print and maintain. So unless you're really fancy restaurants, you can't reprint them. But you can kind of look closely to see when did a restaurant want to seem timeless or when did they want to play with time a bit. So whether they're ephemera or not,
It depends, I guess. Yeah.
they do play with time in interesting ways.
As you say, sort of fancier restaurants that might print the menu every day because they are explicitly saying this is the seasonal moment of this menu. And so that menu might be printed with a date and might be considered ephemeral, but might also be considered more permanent because it's got that date stamp on it. But so many restaurants, and as you mentioned, Chinese restaurants in the history of Canada that were presenting a kind of standardized public-facing offer, that would be a very different kind of menu than what would come across in some local seasonal, dare I say it, Michelin-starred restaurant.
Yes. I mean, that makes me think about the opportunity of having so many menus to access as a historian, like when they're being archived. Before, it's like if you just found one menu, that tells a very interesting story. But being able to see a large variety of menus from maybe around the same time period or the same type of cuisine or from the same community, you can start seeing those different community logics or quote unquote rules that were set up. So with Chinese menus, that's a great example. And that's something that Lily Cho has pointed out. The menus document this kind of coordinated effort from Chinese Canadian restaurateurs to create a very unified, almost franchise-like cuisine.
So constructing a kind of common language or common rhetoric across all the menus so that they were establishing this idea of Chinese Canadian cuisine, largely directed at non-Chinese consumers, although you also say that some menus are unofficial and don't necessarily appear on the printed page. And there are also the secret menu, the menu for the insiders. And that's a whole other kind of menu that is known but not officialized on paper.
Yeah, so I think that's the next step in my menu analysis is how do I find traces of those, whether they're written down. I'm sure, yeah, I feel like I've seen some hints, but I mean, the whole point of a secret menu is that it's secret. So
Yeah.
turning to oral histories or other sources is always important, right? So while this whole article is about how to use menus, I definitely don't say like only use menus. You definitely should use all different types of primary sources in conversation with them.
For sure. So one of the things that's sort of remarkable about this article that you've written is that you've proposed a very formalized method for analyzing menus. And I wonder if you could walk us through that, because it's the first time that I've seen it both prescriptive but also flexibly offered as a methodology for analyzing such a document. How do you approach analyzing a menu from a historical perspective?
Yeah, so my method has 4 steps that I've developed over the years of trying to make sense of these documents. And like you said, these steps are meant to offer guidance, but also meant to be as open as possible and to kind of draw out all the meaning from these very complex or tricky sources. And so the first step in the menu analysis is just to identify everything that you can and cannot. And so this is, I think, where a lot of people start and stop with menus. It's like, oh, they see a dish, they see the location of the restaurant, the type of cuisine they do, what languages are on the menu. You can identify whether or not there's a date, whether or not there's paragraph texts. Is there an image of the dishes that they serve? So start kind of just creating a broad catalog. So just document everything that you see. And that's meant to cast a wide net. The second step is kind of finding the logic or the story of the menu. And so this one's a bit trickier and starts moving away from a more superficial rating to a more in-depth or close rating of the menu.
So that's going beyond what we might call a kind of classic text analysis into more of a contextual or discoursey, but reading through the lines rather than just reading the lines themselves.
Yeah, and sometimes, depending on the menu, it might be easier to read the story or not. So sometimes menus have a literal story on them. So they tell the story of the restaurant and they tell how they want the diner to approach their food. Other times, it's more hidden in the structure or the layout of the menu. And so my favorite example of the clear logic is the combo meals, right? So in Chinese Canadian restaurants, a lot of different cuisines. It's like if your cuisine is eaten a different way, you have to teach your diners how to do that. So for Chinese restaurants, placing meals into a combo teaches people how to eat family style rather than just have giant entrees for themselves. And so the third step I call mess and marginalia. So these are those things that diners added to the menus, or chefs, or literally anyone whose hands are on these documents. That's why I added mess. Some of the most interesting quote unquote marginalia on these menus are stains or burn marks or other remnants of food. And so while a lot of those are removed when they're archived, because that's not great for document preservation, they do leave traces. And so how do you make sense of those in creative ways?
And it demonstrates that the menu is a real thing that existed in a real environment and with real food and with real humans attached to it.
Yeah, it reminds you, for me, it reminds you to interact with them like they were meant, which I think is one of the key parts of this menu analysis that I encourage, is to talk to these menus, reference these menus like you would as a diner. Yeah. Right. So pay attention to your appetite. What's catching your eye? They're meant to entice you. So be enticed a little bit. That helps it. For me, that helps you really form a real relationship with these sources.
It's interesting, because we talk a lot about relationality in food systems these days. It's a really important way to understand how things are not necessarily linear or obvious or cause and effect based. But the idea of having a relationship with an archival document is wonderful. It's really, it takes it to that additional space of relationality that we really should be thinking about almost all the time.
This is maybe a side tangent, but for a historian, finding relational work or relating to the documents has been super important for me, because it's a pretty, I can't speak for other disciplines, but historian, it's a pretty isolating discipline. It's you and these documents, and most likely a lot of people who are passed away. But finding that relation is kind of tricky at times. So one way, especially food history in particular, there's an interesting opportunity, because a lot of the sources you work with kind of encourage interactivity or connection forming, like menus. And then I also talk a little bit about cookbooks in there as well. And then the last step, which I kind of considered a bonus step for a lot of the times I was analyzing menus, was cross-menu comparison. I say it's bonus step because it wasn't possible until large archives were able to collect enough to compare. And so this includes comparison of one restaurant's menus over time. So if you can find an earlier menu and then a later menu in the restaurant's life, that offers a lot of great opportunities to write microhistory or capture that restaurant. And then also cross geographies. Mm-hmm. I think in this article, I do a bit of both, but I kind of highlight the life story of Lychee Garden, which is a very important restaurant in Toronto. And I do that through the menus. And for that history, I'm trying to be very strict. It's like, I'm only going to use the menus to tell this story, even though I have other sources to kind of flesh it out, but just to really show how these documents themselves capture a lot. But you could also do, one of my favorite things to do with students was to teach about Chinese cuisine around the world using different menus to see which kind of special dish popped up, how did they adapt to local communities. Also, like, why did chop suey pop over everywhere? So...
Sure. Well, the cross-menu analysis is in some ways sort of like what Karen Barad describes as a differential analysis or a diffractive analysis, where you're looking at sort of interference patterns between common wavelengths or menus that come as wavelengths emerging from restaurants. It's a completely fascinating process, and I'm so glad you formalize it this way, because it lends some repeatability, but also some offerings to the historian to think beyond what's on the page and think through the menu towards the histories and the futures of a given restaurant. I'm so grateful to you for sharing this all with us, and so glad that we got to have this time to talk about it. Thanks again.
Yes, thank you so much.
Anson Hunt is a former cook and is now a current PhD student at Carleton University in Ottawa. His research evolves around critical perspectives of alternative food systems and the potential roles of chefs and restaurants in the production and the reception of food information.
My name is Anson Hunt. I am a PhD candidate in Communication and Media Studies at Carleton University and a former cook throughout most of my high school and post-secondary education. My main research interest, which is largely informed by my personal experiences, is professional kitchens and restaurants more broadly. Specifically, I work at the intersection of media studies and food studies, exploring how theorizing restaurant kitchens themselves as media can contribute to ideas and conceptions around sustainable restaurants and sustainable food systems. For me, one of the most exciting implications of this article is the challenge from Song-Nichols to study menus as a medium between not just restaurateur and perceived diner, but also restaurateur and society more broadly. As we know, restaurants are an important site of not just consumption of food, but production and formation of social class. This can be realized through the acts of ordering, where you expend cultural capital in order to order a specific dish, or even position yourself as an insider by ordering off menu. One of the things that stood out in particular was the idea of menus being used to represent cuisines more broadly. This highlights how restaurants themselves have the power to tell stories about a type of cooking, whether that's Chinese food or sustainable food, and also position that food as desirable food for a specific class. This article also helped evolve my thinking about restaurants and space. I've been interested in how the architecture, layout, and decorations of a restaurant help act as mediators between chefs and restaurateurs and guests, how the space itself can help to sell a diner on a particular vision. However, I hadn't considered menus specifically beyond just part of this puzzle. Yet, as a text in and of themselves, and as something a diner almost always interacts with personally before the food, I was reminded that menus are just as much a critical part of this process, and the materiality of the menu itself matters just as much as the content of the dishes described. For other readers of this article, I want to propose 2 ways this article can be used, regardless of if your interests lie with restaurants, menus, or archival work more generally. The first is a methodological commitment to detail and margin. Close reading and close analysis, combined with an embrace of the personal relationship, is, I think, useful as a method when analyzing any text. Food is such an intimate object, and it's important to recognize and make use of that intimacy. This methodology is an excellent example of this. The second, more broader takeaway is to think through how texts like menus are outcomes of power struggles. As the author mentioned, one of the missing details in menus is often who wrote them themselves. This presents us with an unfinished story of how this menu came to be. How much influence did the chef have versus the owner? Do the cooks or waitstaff have any input at all? In the case of chain restaurants, it seems plausible that an unknown corporate department designed the menus without any input from those producing and serving the food. Might this lack of historical information inspire a contemporary investigation of the power dynamics behind the piece of laminated paper you are handed or the QR code you scan?
When we started to conceive of this podcast, the notion of a menu was already in our heads as a framing device for each episode. It's a common enough trope and perhaps already cliché in the world of food media, but it seemed to work. Menu as object is just so evocative of making choices, of selecting one's favorites, of constructing a meal for oneself. And with the digitization of everything, you, as podcast listeners, can remix these offerings as much as you want. Indeed, that was kind of our intent. At the same time, though, there's something kind of nice about having things decided for you. A guidance, a curation, a suggested conversation. I hope we make both things possible here at Digesting Food Studies. Thank you to our richly sauced and soul-satisfying guests, Alexia Moyer, Koby Song-Nichols, and Anson Hunt. My compliments to both the front and back of house, and the menus that connect them. Digesting Food Studies executive producers are Rachel Engler-Stringer, Laurence Godin, Charles Levko, Phil Loring, and Kristen Lowett. I'm David Santo. Please do take a minute to like, subscribe, and rate the show, and if there's something you'd like to see on future menus, leave a note with the maître d' or your charming server. While allergies and intolerances can't quite be accommodated here, we're always looking for ways to satisfy your appetites. A menu is a list of options, organized according to a logic determined by its writer. Etymologically, in French, menu means small and detailed. Some contemporary menus are anything but, while others barely hint at what's going to be on the plate. As of 1967, menu has also come to mean a list of options displayed on a screen, and in our day, both restaurant menus and screen-based offerings have conflated themselves thanks to QR codes and our portable devices. What will historians of the future make of our transitions from slate to paper to touchscreen? Will they decry the disappearance of food residues from our physical archives? And will menus become more or less ephemeral as clouds replace leather binding and options expand? So many questions, so little time. Check, please!